Tonight, one of the most closely watched federal gunfights in America has taken a dramatic turn, and this time, the ATF is the side that gave ground. The federal government has now settled major litigation over forced reset triggers, agreed to return many of the devices it had previously seized, and agreed not to enforce federal machine gun restrictions against certain eligible models. That is the rule change. And for lawful gun owners across the country, especially older Americans who care about staying on the right side of the law, the big question is simple. Is this really the major nationwide victory it sounds like? Or is there an important catch buried in the details? That is exactly what we're going to break down today, carefully and clearly, because this story is already being exaggerated online. Some people are saying the ATF just got stripped of its power. Others are claiming every rapid-fire device is now legal nationwide. Neither of those statements tells the full story. What is true is important enough on its own, and you do not need hype to understand why this case matters. Here is the calm, verified version. The confirmed development is that the Department of Justice announced a settlement in litigation involving rare breed triggers. Under that settlement, the federal government agreed to stop treating certain eligible forced reset triggers as machine guns for federal enforcement purposes, and the ATF published guidance about returning eligible devices that had been seized or voluntarily surrendered. That is not rumor. That is official. It is a real reversal from the earlier federal position. Now, if you have followed firearms policy for years, you know that is a major shift. The ATF had previously taken the position that some forced reset triggers effectively turned certain firearms into machine guns under federal law. That earlier classification led to enforcement actions, warnings, seizures, and lawsuits. But then came a series of legal blows to that approach. In July of 2024, a federal judge in Texas ruled that the ATF had gone beyond its legal authority when it classified forced reset trigger-equipped guns as machine guns. That judge relied in part on the Supreme Court's bump stock reasoning, which focused on the statutory definition of a machine gun and the requirement that a firearm fire continuously with a single function of the trigger. That court ruling was one of the key moments that set the stage for everything that happened next. So when people say the ATF just lost a major case, that is not coming out of nowhere. It comes from the fact that the federal government's position was hit in court, the litigation kept building, and then instead of pressing forward all the way, the DOJ settled. But here is where this story becomes especially important for seniors, retirees, and longtime lawful gun owners. People in this audience are often the most careful gun owners in the country. You're not looking for internet slogans. You're not chasing every product trend. Many of you are veterans, homeowners, former law enforcement, sport shooters, collectors, or simply Americans who believe in staying informed and staying legal. And that is why this story matters to you more than it may matter to younger viewers scrolling through headlines. Because the real risk is not just the law itself. The real risk is misunderstanding the law. This federal settlement does affect the entire country in one sense. It changes the federal government's position nationwide on eligible forced reset triggers. That is why people are describing this as a victory in all 50 states. The federal change is not limited to one region. But that does not mean all 50 states now allow these devices, and that is the part some channels are skipping. The ATF itself says some states independently prohibit forced reset triggers or similar trigger-activating devices, so the federal government may have stepped back, but your state may not have. That means a viewer in one state could hear this story and experience a genuine change in federal risk, while a viewer in another state could hear the same story and still be restricted under state law. That is a huge difference. And if you miss that difference, you could make a costly mistake. Let me ask you this. Should one headline be enough to convince a law-abiding gun owner that the legal picture is completely clear? It shouldn't be. Not in a case like this. Here is what officially changed under the settlement. The government agreed to return certain eligible rare breed FRT-15 and wide-open trigger devices that were seized or voluntarily surrendered, as long as they were not being held as evidence in a criminal investigation or prosecution and were not otherwise subject to forfeiture. The ATF also stated that it would not enforce federal statutes or related interpretations treating an eligible forced reset trigger as a machine gun. That sounds broad, and it is significant, but it is not unlimited. The ATF also says very clearly that the settlement only covers eligible forced reset triggers. It does not cover every conversion device on the market. The agency specifically says that switches, drop-in auto-sears, lightning links, and other machine gun conversion devices are not covered. That matters, because once a story like this hits the internet, people start lumping completely different products together as if one legal development applies to all of them. It does not. There is another limit that deserves careful attention. The DOJ said the settlement included public safety conditions, including that Rare Breed would not develop or design forced reset triggers for use in pistols. Reuters also reported that the administration agreed not to apply the machine gun ban to these devices so long as they are not designed for use with handguns. So again, this is a major federal pullback, but it is not a free-for-all. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. A lot of viewers are hearing settlement and assuming that means the issue is over. Not necessarily. In fact, after the settlement was announced, 15 states and the District of Columbia sued to block the return of thousands of previously seized forced reset triggers. Those states argued the devices remain illegal under federal law and should not be returned. So even after this major win for affected gun owners, the broader fight did not disappear. It continued in another form. In just a moment, I'll explain what would actually need to happen before this becomes the kind of lasting nationwide legal certainty many gun owners think it already is. Because right now, the biggest mistake you can make is confusing a major policy reversal with a permanently settled legal landscape. Before we get there, there is one more point we need to clear up, because this is where exaggeration gets dangerous. Some channels are talking as if this one case means the ATF has now lost every major firearms issue. That is simply not accurate. In March of 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld federal restrictions on ghost gun kits and unfinished frames and receivers, ruling that ATF did have authority in that context under the Gun Control Act. So the honest version is this. The ATF suffered a major defeat in the forced reset trigger fight, but the agency did not lose all power over gun regulation. If you want the truth, it is more precise than the slogans. And for this audience, precision matters. Because if you are retired, living on a fixed income, managing a household budget carefully, or helping children and grandchildren make responsible decisions, you do not need confusion. You do not need a rushed purchase based on a misleading clip. You need clarity. So, what would have to happen before this becomes more permanent and less uncertain? First, Congress could pass legislation that clearly defines these devices and removes the gray areas that agencies and courts have been fighting over. Second, additional appellate decisions could lock in a more durable national legal interpretation. Third, future administrations would have to choose not to reverse course yet again. And fourth, state laws would still need to be considered separately, because a federal settlement does not erase a state prohibition. That means viewers should not interpret this as the end of all risk. It is better understood as a major federal victory in one category of litigation, with ongoing legal and state-level complications still very much alive. Here is the practical timeline part. The ATF said notices to owners of eligible devices were to be mailed by June 30th, 2025, and it listed September 30th, 2025 as the deadline for return requests under the settlement. That is important because many online discussions make this sound like an open-ended process. It was not described that way in the ATF's own guidance. So if someone says, "You can just claim one now," that may not match the actual published timeline. And that leads to the most practical question of all. What should viewers do right now? First, do not assume this federal change automatically makes a device lawful where you live. check your state law. Second, do not assume every product being marketed online is covered by this settlement. The ATF limited its guidance to eligible forced reset triggers and specifically excluded other conversion devices. Third, if you previously received a warning notice, surrendered a device, or believe you may have been part of the affected group, rely on official ATF guidance and qualified legal advice in your own state if needed. Fourth, be cautious about social media claims that use phrases like "legal in all 50 states now" without explaining the federal versus state distinction. That kind of wording may be catchy, but it can leave out the most important part of the story. Here's another question for you. When government agencies reverse themselves this dramatically, do you think that builds trust? Or does it make ordinary citizens even more uncertain about what the law really is? That is one reason this case is bigger than just one device. It raises a larger concern about agency power, enforcement swings, and how quickly the rules can seem to change for ordinary law-abiding people. The ATF itself has publicly described its current direction as a new era of reform, with changes in enforcement policy and a stated goal of rebuilding trust. Whether viewers agree with that language or not, it tells you something important. This forced reset trigger case is not happening in isolation. It is part of a larger change in tone and policy coming out of Washington. And for older Americans, that means staying informed matters more than ever. Because in this stage of life, most of you are not looking for drama. You are looking for stability. You want to know what is legal, what has changed, and what has not changed. You want to avoid risk, avoid confusion, and avoid getting caught between a federal announcement and a state restriction that points in another direction. So let's sum this up as clearly as possible. Yes, the ATF and DOJ did back away from their earlier position in a major forced reset trigger fight. Yes, the federal government settled the litigation and agreed to return many eligible devices. Yes, that is a significant win for the affected gun owners and a real setback for the government's previous classification strategy. But no, this does not legalize every conversion device. No, it does not wipe out state laws. And no, it does not mean every ATF firearm rule has collapsed. The real takeaway is this. A major federal rule position has been reversed, a meaningful legal victory has been scored, but responsible gun owners still need to read the fine print, respect state law, and ignore the internet noise. If you want, tell me where you stand on this. Do you think this was a proper correction of agency overreach? Or do you think the courts and Congress still need to give Americans much clearer rules than this? And if you value straightforward, verified updates without the shouting and without the spin, make sure you subscribe. This channel is here to help you separate confirmed facts from rumors so you can stay informed, stay calm, and stay ahead of changes that actually affect your life.